She cooked on a stove that weighed more than she did, in a kitchen with no electricity, no fridge, and no running water. She pumped water from a well, churned butter by hand, and baked bread every single day of her life. And somehow, the food she made in that dark little kitchen has never been matched. Not once. Not by anyone. Why? The kitchen that ran on wooden guts. Okay, so before we talk about what was on the plate, you need to understand what Grandma was working with, because it was basically another planet compared to what we have now. In 1922, only 3% of American farms had electricity. 3%. That means 97 out of every 100 farm families across Iowa, Kansas, West Virginia, Tennessee, Nebraska, Ohio, the Dakotas, all of them were living and cooking and surviving without a single light switch. The cities had electricity by then. New York, Chicago, even smaller towns were wired up. But the farms? Total darkness after sundown. Kerosene lamps and the glow from the stove. That was it. And that stove was the center of absolutely everything. It was a massive cast iron beast, sometimes 400 or 500 pounds, sitting against the kitchen wall with a stovepipe running up through the ceiling. One side had the firebox where Grandma burned split oak or hickory or whatever hardwood Grandpa had chopped and stacked. The other side had the oven, and across the top, 6 flat iron burners. But here's what trips people up. Those burners did not all run the same temperature. The ones nearest the fire were screaming hot. The middle ones were medium. The far ones were just barely warm. Grandma did not turn a dial. She moved her skillet from one spot to another, constantly adjusting, reading the heat with the palm of her hand. And the oven had no real thermostat. Cookbooks from back then did not say preheat to 375. They said bake in a moderate oven. Grandma knew what that meant because she stuck her hand inside and counted. 30 seconds meant about 300 degrees. If she yanked her hand back at 10, she was pushing 450. Her mother taught her this, her grandmother before that. It was not something you could learn from a book. You had to feel it. Every morning started with fire. Grandma was up before anybody, around 4:30, getting that stove going. In winter, she kept embers alive overnight so the kitchen was not completely frozen by dawn. In summer, she let the fire die and rebuilt it from scratch each morning with kindling and old newspaper. Grandpa filled the wood box beside the stove every evening, and that wood box being full was one of the most important things on the entire farm. No wood, no fire, no food. Simple as that. A group of people tried cooking on a real 1920s wood stove at the Wessel's Living History Farm in Nebraska. A dozen of them working together could barely handle one meal. One woman looked around afterward and said, "Can you imagine doing this day in, day out? This is a full-time job." Grandma did it alone, 3 meals a day, 7 days a week, for decades. And what she put on the table after all that, that is where this gets wild. Where every bite came from. There was no grocery run, no delivery, no freezer section. On most 1920s farms, the nearest store was miles away over dirt roads, and you only went for things you could not grow or make yourself. Coffee, sugar, salt, maybe some fabric. Everything else came from the dirt under your feet and the animals in your barn. Grandma's garden was not some cute little side project. It was the difference between eating and going hungry. In Ohio, in Iowa, and Indiana, she grew rows of potatoes, sweet corn, green beans, onions, carrots, and turnips. Down in Tennessee and West Virginia, She had pole beans climbing up sticks, tomatoes sprawling across the ground, and patches of cabbage she would turn into sauerkraut. In Kansas and Nebraska, the gardens were drier and tougher, but she still pulled out squash, beets, and enough potatoes to fill a cellar. Everywhere, she grew herbs along the fence line: sage, thyme, dill, apple trees in the yard, and every last thing that grew in the summer had to be saved for winter, because once the frost hit, the garden was dead. So where did it all go? Underground. Almost every farmhouse had a root cellar, a room dug into the earth, either under the house or carved into a hillside. The temperature down there stayed between 32 and 50 degrees all year, naturally, with no machine. Potatoes went into straw-lined barrels. Carrots sat in boxes of damp sand. Apples hung from ceiling beams in mesh bags. That cellar smelled like cold earth and old wood. It was the closest thing any of these families had to a refrigerator. For milk and butter, families across the Midwest and South used spring houses, tiny stone buildings built over cold-running creeks. Crocks of butter and pitchers of milk sat right in the flowing water to stay cool. Others lowered food into the well in buckets. Some had ice boxes, wooden cabinets with a big block of ice in the top. In town, an iceman brought the ice on a wagon. But out on the remote farms in places like rural Maine or the hollows of Kentucky, no iceman ever showed up. Then came the canning. Every summer and fall, Grandma stood over that hot stove for weeks putting up food in glass jars. Tomatoes, green beans, pickled cucumbers, sauerkraut, peaches, sealed tight and stored in the cellar. Meat got smoked in the smokehouse or packed in salt brine. A well-smoked Virginia ham or a Kentucky country ham could hang for months without going bad. Pork was king on most farms because pigs were cheap to raise and the meat held up. Beef spoiled fast, so families ate it right after butchering and shared the rest with neighbors before it turned. Every bite that hit the supper table touched Grandma's hands at least twice. Once, when she grew it, picked it, and put it away. And again, when she pulled it from the cellar, prepared it, and cooked it. Nothing came from a box. What supper actually looked like. All right, so here is the part everybody wants to hear. What was actually on the table when the sun went down? First surprise. Supper was not even the big meal. The main event was dinner, served around noon, when the men came in from the fields completely wiped out. That was the spread. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes, gravy, fresh bread, vegetables from the garden, pie. The whole thing. Dinner was the fuel for the rest of the working day. Supper came at the tail end of everything. Cows milked again, chickens locked up, horses watered. By the time Grandma started pulling supper together, she'd been going for 15 straight hours. So supper was simpler, warmer, easier, made from whatever she could grab without starting a whole new production. And honestly, the simplest meals were the ones people remember most. In West Virginia and across Appalachia, supper was often a big pot of soup beans, pinto beans, that had been simmering on the back of the wood stove all afternoon, with a ham hock or a chunk of salt pork for flavor, served with a fat wedge of cornbread baked in a cast iron skillet, greased with bacon drippings. One man from Wayne County said his family had beans and taters for dinner, and taters and beans for supper. That was it. That was the rotation. And those two dishes gave you every amino acid your body needed. In Iowa and Nebraska and across the Midwest, supper might be a thick potato soup made from whatever was down in the root cellar, simmered in broth Grandma had boiled from chicken bones earlier that week. or fried eggs with thick slices of salt pork and hot buttermilk biscuits, or a plate of fried potatoes with onions, left over from dinner, crisped up again until the edges went brown and crunchy. Down in the South, in Tennessee and Kentucky and North Carolina, supper could be chicken and dumplings made from a hen Grandma caught and killed that afternoon. She boiled it until the meat fell off the bone, then dropped strips of biscuit dough right into the simmering stock, or fried pork chops with sawmill gravy over biscuits, or greens, collards, or turnip greens, cooked down with a piece of fatback until they were soft and smoky. In Maine and the Northeast, supper was often baked beans with brown bread, or chowder made from whatever fish came out of the nearest creek or pond, or a boiled dinner with salt beef and root vegetables pulled straight from the cellar that afternoon. In the Plain States, where wheat grew better than corn, supper might be thick slices of fresh wheat bread with ham and fried eggs. And everywhere across the country, there was bread. Grandma baked it fresh every single day. She mixed the dough in the morning, set it near the warm stove to rise, punched it down, shaped the loaves, and slid them into the oven so they were ready by evening. The smell of that bread baking filled the house and got into the curtains and the walls. One man from North Carolina remembered sneaking out of bed at night with his brother, tiptoeing into the dark kitchen, and fixing a plate of leftover cornbread and pinto beans by the warmth of the dying stove. He called it a feast. 50 years later, he said he wished he could go back to those nights more than anything in the world. Look at how few ingredients were in any of these meals. Soup beans were dried pintos, water, a ham hock, and an onion. Biscuits were flour, lard, salt, and buttermilk. Cornbread was cornmeal, an egg, buttermilk, and bacon grease. Apple pie was apples, sugar, cinnamon, and lard for the crust. No box mix, no packet of seasoning, no shortcut. Grandma made it taste like magic using salt, pepper, a little sage from the garden, and 40 years of experience. The invisible mountain of work. The food was only the tip of it. What made every supper extraordinary was the mountain of physical labor hiding behind it, and most of us today truly cannot picture it. Water first. No pipes, no faucet. If Grandma needed water, someone walked out to the hand pump in the yard, grabbed the handle, and worked it up and down until water came up, then carried the bucket inside. In winter across the Midwest and Northeast, the pump froze solid, and you had to pour warm water from a kettle into it just to get it going. One woman from a farm in Iowa said pumping water by hand got your blood running good, especially on wash days when the buckets never seemed to stop. What you carried in, you had to carry back out. Then butter. Nobody bought it. Grandma milked the cow at dawn, let the pail sit until cream floated to the top, skimmed it, poured it into the churn, and pumped that plunger for 20 or 30 minutes until the cream turned to butter. Washed it, salted it, pressed the water out, packed it into a crock, all before breakfast even started. Spices were all whole. Peppercorns got crushed in a mortar and pestle. Nutmeg got grated by hand. Cinnamon came in sticks. Salt came in blocks you had to crack apart. Nothing arrived ready to use. Dishes after supper, no dishwasher, no hot water tap. Grandma heated water on the stove, poured it in a basin, scrubbed every plate and fork and pot with soap she made from lard and lye, rinsed in a second basin, dried everything on a cloth. For a family of 8, one meal's dishes took an hour. 3 meals a day. Every day. And all of this under the flicker of a kerosene lamp. Once the sun dropped, that lamp and the orange glow through the stove's iron grates was all the light in the house. Picture standing over a blazing stove in July in a kitchen in Tennessee with no fan, no air conditioning, flies landing on everything, heat pressing against your face and arms. A lot of women moved the cooking outside to a back porch or a little wash house just so the family could breathe indoors. Studies from that era found rural women in the 1920s spent 4.5 hours a day just on cooking and cleanup. That did not count gardening, canning, doing laundry by hand, mending clothes, milking cows, or raising children. The kitchen alone ate half the daylight. When the family sat down, when supper was finally ready, the family came to the table. A big wooden table, bench on one side, mismatched chairs on the other. No television, no phone, no radio yet on most farms. Just the crackle of the fire and voices. Grace was said. Food came out in bowls and platters. Bread went around with butter and a jar of strawberry preserves or apple butter. Soup got ladled. Milk poured from a heavy pitcher, and they talked. About the weather, the crops, who was fixing the fence tomorrow, what the preacher said on Sunday. Nothing dramatic, nothing for an audience, just a family sitting together. After supper, the kids cleared the table. Grandma washed while a daughter dried. Leftover beans went into a crock for the spring house. Grandpa might shake the wire popcorn popper over the stove until it burst open, melt a chunk of homemade butter, pour it over the top, and call it a treat fit for a king. He would open the oven door, put his stocking feet inside to warm them, and lean back in the rocking chair while a cat or two slept behind the stove. Lamps got trimmed. The stove got banked for the night, packed with slow-burning oak. The flue shut down so the fire would smolder until morning. Kids said their prayers and climbed under quilts Grandma had stitched from old flour sacks and worn-out dresses. The house went quiet. Just the tick of cooling iron and wind against the glass. And then finally, she sat down. Maybe some mending. Maybe she listened to one of the girls play a waltz on the old pump organ. Maybe she just closed her eyes. Tomorrow, all of it starts again. What disappeared when the switch got flipped? When electricity reached these farms in the late 1930s and 1940s, an entire world vanished in about 15 years. In 1925, only 3% of farms had power. By 1953, over 90% were wired. That fast. The wood stoves got dragged into barns and sheds. Some got junked. The root cellars went dark and empty. The ice boxes ended up in scrap piles. And every skill Grandma spent her whole life mastering disappeared with them. Reading fire by the feel of heat on bare skin, timing bread in an oven with no thermostat, keeping a family of 8 fed through a Nebraska winter with nothing but a smokehouse and a cellar full of jars. One generation knew all of this. The next had refrigerators and never needed to learn. But what people talk about most is the taste. You can still find Grandma's biscuit recipe on a yellowed card in a kitchen drawer. Same ingredients: flour, lard, salt, buttermilk. But everyone who grew up eating food from that wood stove says the same thing. Nothing they ate afterward ever came close. Something was different. Something you cannot write on a recipe card. Maybe it was the oak smoke curling through the cast iron. Maybe it was butter that was grass and cream and salt 2 hours earlier. Maybe a pot of Appalachian soup beans that spent 6 hours simmering over a real wood fire with a ham hock from a hog you raised yourself just tastes different from anything a gas stove or a microwave can produce. Maybe food that took 5 hours of labor, a root cellar full of hand-preserved vegetables, and a stove you had to feed like a living animal carries something in it that modern cooking simply cannot touch. Grandma never tried to explain it. She never wrote a cookbook. She never measured a single thing. She just walked into that kitchen every morning in the dark, lit a fire, and fed the people she loved every single day of her life. Nobody thanked her. Nobody filmed it. She just stood at that stove every night and fed everyone she loved. That was the whole story. Subscribe for more.